Can you explain the Ubisoft news like I'm 10 years old? Thanks. And Audentes Fortuna Evat. Yeah, I think I can. If you missed this news, it's basically, I mean, it's pretty simple. Ubisoft is creating a new entity. They are moving a lot of the most valuable assets, well, 3, Far Cry, AC, and Rainbow Six. They're moving those brands effectively into the new entity. Tencent is investing in that new entity to value it at like $4 billion. And that entity will have its own leadership structure, its own management, and will be in charge of all of that. But money will flow back to Ubisoft in exchange for those licenses. Let me demonstrate this with the greatest visual aid tool known to mankind, MS Paint. You have Ubisoft, big UB. Ubisoft is currently valued at roughly 1.5 billion, okay? And they have a couple of big IP within them, right, that they own. What's just happened is that they are moving these 3 IP over into a new entity that they've created. So these IP are now in here. And then Tencent is coming in and buying a quarter of that chunk of that new entity, Tencent. And they put in a solid girthy I think it was 1.16 or something billion dollars into that new entity. And by doing that, this new entity becomes valued at roughly $4 billion, right? So you might be wondering, how does this work if just yesterday these things were in here and this was only worth 1.5? Why is it that moving it somewhere else makes it now worth 4? Good question. So anyway, I'm being sassy. All it basically has to do is that like Ubisoft has a bunch of, let's just say, dead weight. They have a lot of financial dead weight. They have some debt. They have leases. They have more employees than they frankly should at the size they are with the revenue they're bringing in. They have a lot of things pulling them down. They also, something I haven't heard discussed much, is they have a lot of agreements with like governments throughout Europe and throughout the world that give them artistic grants, that give them lots of money to help develop games. But like that also has all sorts of restrictions. Skull and Bones notably took a lot of money from the Singaporean government. And that's the only reason that game wasn't canceled, was because they had an agreement with the government that made it so they couldn't cancel the game. And all of those things represent an albatross around their necks. But by creating a new entity that's free of those obligations and burdens, they can value it more purely. Because basically what's going to happen now is that this entity is going to operate these IP, and these IP, AC, Far Cry, and Rainbow Six, all of the employees at Montreal, at Quebec, at Sofia, at all of these different Ubisoft studios, those employees will still be working on these IP. Their day-to-day probably doesn't change much, frankly. But the money that's generated from this entity gets kicked back to Ubisoft. So people were like, oh, does Ubisoft go under? Do they just close Ubisoft now? No, Ubisoft still owns 75% of this. They still own it, but they take the money in as a royalty, not directly as like revenue from product sales. Again, most of this is just a matter of like, it's just an accounting thing. Like, I think that's what most of this is. People, I think, are confused. Like, oh, this is going to be like a new company. It's going to be UB like hard. And this is going to be the new company that makes all these games. No. This is just a new entity, a shell that holds these things. And these things are licensed from Ubisoft. Royalties go out to Ubisoft, back to Ubisoft, but they're not technically under the Ubisoft direct mantle. In practical terms, almost nothing will change for the consumer. I don't think you're going to notice any difference. I really don't. I really don't. The Gameoff family is still in charge. Tencent, they have all sorts of added protections where they have put options available to them, meaning for the next 4 years, if Tencent wants to get out of this, they can sell their shares at guaranteed prices so that they don't lose this investment. Because what happened with Tencent was basically like the stock was going like this. Tencent invested a ton right here like 4 years ago, and then the stock went down like this. And now we're here. And Tencent naturally is pretty pissed off about that because they invested a ton of money right here, and now they've lost out on all of that. But with this new deal, they put in 1.16 billion, and they have put options available to them to protect their investment. There's all sorts of other things like that as part of this deal, where it basically just means that Tencent can give Ubisoft more money to be more flexible, to do what they need to do to continue doubling down and putting out big Assassin's Creed, Rainbow Six, and Far Cry games that will actually make them money. And they can do that without having to give up more equity in the Ubisoft core company. And the Gameoff family gets to stay in power, which is all they really wanted. So for the consumer, I don't think you notice anything change. I really don't. I don't think it'll be any different for us. Within the company, stuff will shift and move and change, sure. But practically for the consumer, I don't think anything really changes. And as I said, like this isn't scandalous. I don't think this was directly related to AC Shadows or anything. I think probably the difference was if AC Shadows did really, really, really poorly, Tencent probably would have put 1.16 billion in for a 40% stake or a 50% stake. But because it did decently well, they got 25%. And I think that that's mainly what they were waiting to see. But this certainly, I bet you all the money I have that this deal was pretty much locked and loaded well before the launch of AC Shadows. And the AC Shadows basically determined what share of equity that Tencent would be getting. Yeah, explain it to me like I'm 3. Basically nothing changes, but Ubisoft gets a bunch of Chinese money without having to give up ownership. That's basically what's happening here.